Hey, everybody, welcome. So glad you're here tonight. And we have so much to talk about. The week that we have been waiting for is finally here. That's right. We had Melanie Gibb and Zulema Pastenes on the witness stand, and we have a lot of legal issues to talk about. There's a whole bunch of issues about 404B information, evidence, and lots of questions. So I'm going to just kind of chat for a while everybody catches up. Welcome. It has been kind of interesting for me. The last time I had to get up and go to court every morning was 4 years ago. So it's been getting back in the routine of that's been pretty interesting. And but it's been super fun. I've met some wonderful people. As I've always said, one of the only silver linings to this awful tragedy is the fact that we have all met some amazing people as a result. You can see behind me, I've been putting up my daily tickets to get into the courtroom. I still have a couple to put up from this week, but I've been sort of stacking them up there so that it's sort of a visual of every day that we've been in the courtroom. So we're not going to talk too much about week before because we went over that. It was all jury selection stuff. And there is so much to talk about on this week. So I have pages and pages and pages of notes. So I'm going to go over them, not in depth, but we will go over them so everybody has a good idea of who the witnesses were, why they were called, and some of the interesting, maybe new information that we hadn't heard before. So let's dive into it. We started with opening statements. There were a few kind of interesting little things that came out of those opening statements, but they were all things that we're going to hear about in the testimony, so I'm not going to belabor them. To call the defense's opening statement lackluster would be kind. Jim Archibald got up. He has a very kind of monotone, plodding kind of delivery. And he got up and said, I'm a public defender. I'm paid for by your tax dollars. Thank you very much for paying your taxes. And went on to talk about who Lori was, who her family were. One interesting thing that he said, and I am going to get through my notes for that. One of the interesting things that he did say about Lori, and that kind of resonated a little bit. First of all, the prosecutor got up on opening and said, this is a case about money, power, and sex. And Lori Vallow was using money, power, and sex to get more money, power, and sex. She said Tylee had money and Lori wanted it, and Tylee was gone. JJ took a lot of her time that she couldn't spend with Chad Daybell and took a lot of effort, and she was gone. Lori wanted Tammy Daybell's husband and her insurance money, and so Tammy was gone. And that was kind of her theme. There were a few somewhat graphic photos that were shown during her opening as she talked about the deaths of each one of the victims. There was a photo of JJ's body still in its grave, but exposed so that you could see the black plastic. There was a photo of bone fragments that were found around Tylee's remains. And then they showed Tammy Daybell's autopsy photo. And they were not overly gruesome. I think the prosecution went out of their way to pick the photos that were the least difficult for people to see, because the difficult photos were coming. So, Lindsay Blake did the opening statement. She did a very serviceable job. Was it inspiring or dramatic? No, but it was very serviceable. Then when it was interesting that Lori is sitting in a chair that swivels, and for the most part, she stays pretty still. But as Lindsay was talking in her opening statement about the fact that Lori Vallow believed that she was a translated being, and that she was exalted, Lori started swiveling her chair back and forth, sort of rocking it back and forth. And then excuse me while I shuffle through my notes. Then Jim Archibald's opening statement was pretty generic. He talked a little bit about Lori, who she was, her background. He said, Lori, how did he put it? He said, Lori had a sister and a brother who died. She believes in life hereafter. She believes that she will be reunited with her family, including her children. So that was kind of interesting. He didn't really get into it deeply, but he did get that far. And then he kind of parsed the language in the indictment, talking about, did she kill, or did she assist, or did she command, or did she encourage? And then saying to the jury, they're not sure. How can you be sure? He talked a bit about reasonable doubt and about the alibi. The jury complained about all the loud keyboards happening in the gallery, because there's probably, if there's 60 people in the courtroom, there's probably 50 laptops going all the time. So then the first witness was called, and the first witness was Kay Woodcock. So I'm sure all of you know who Kay is, but just in case, for people who are just getting interested in this case, and believe me, the players and the family tree is mind-boggling and confusing. So Kay Woodcock, Lori Vallow was married to Charles Vallow. Charles was her fourth husband. And Charles's sister, Kay Vallow Woodcock, it was the first witness. Now, for those of you who are unaware, Kay Woodcock has two children, Cresha and Todd. Todd and his girlfriend, Mandy, who Kay pronounces her name Leger, which is very Louisiana, New Orleans, French, had a child. They both had drug issues, and the child was born drug affected and with drugs in his system. He was removed from their care in the hospital, and he was placed in a family caregiver placement with Kay and Larry. When he came out of the hospital, he was actually born 10 weeks premature and spent 7 weeks in the NICU. JJ went home to Kay and Larry, and the state took custody. There was a period of time when when the parents were given the opportunity to get their act together, get some drug treatment, do whatever they needed to do so that the baby could be returned to them. They weren't able to do that. And so the family knew that there was going to be a family adoption. Charles approached Kay and suggested that he and Lori adopt JJ. Kay said Lori and Charles always wanted a child of their own. So Kay was very complimentary of Lori when they first met. She said Lori and Charles had a very active lifestyle. They were active in church. They were busy. And Lori seemed to be, this is a quote, Lori seemed to be the kind of mom every mom wants to be. Kay talked about the fact that one of the conditions of the adoption was that they would maintain their role as JJ's grandparents. And Kay remarked that that when Charles was home, he was always with JJ. That JJ was the focus of his attention when he was home. Kay said she and Lori were close. She said Lori was a doll. They got along really well. And it wasn't until all of this happened that her relationship broke down with Lori. Kay said she met Alex Cox a handful of times. And she said she knew Tylee and that Tylee was a good little sister. We've all heard that. She was very devoted to JJ. And one of the reasons why Kay and Larry felt that it might be better for JJ to be with Charles and Lori was Kay and Larry live in a fairly small community in Louisiana that doesn't have a lot of services. And by that time, it was clear that JJ had some disabilities and was going to need some special services. Charles and Lori were living in the Phoenix area where there are very good services and good schools. So that was part of what convinced them that Lori and Lori and Charles should adopt. There are too many players in this. Lori and Charles should adopt JJ. She commented that as Lori and Charles's relationship started to unravel and Lori started to deepen her commitment to this faith, this belief system that she was working through, things got more complicated. Lori and Charles separated. Lori was gone for almost 3 months and then suddenly just showed back up. In the meantime, Kay was helping Charles. Charles had moved down to the Houston area so that Kay and Larry could be closer. And during the weeks where Charles needed to travel out of town, Kay would come to Texas and stay with JJ. And that was their plan. Kay was also helping Charles with some of his business obligations, which plays into it later because we learn that Kay had access to Charles's computer and to his Gmail account. So Kay went and helped Charles and while he was in Texas. And he approached her about changing the beneficiary on his life insurance to make sure that JJ was taken care of. And Kay committed to him that she would take care of JJ. We have some company tonight. So if you hear some voices in the background, it's because my husband's entertaining an old friend and they're chatting. So after the time that that Lori and Charles separated for the first time, and Lori was gone for that extended period of time. Lori and Charles sort of did what I always called suitcase drills. They were together and they were apart, and they were together and they were apart. By the time that Lori moved back into Chandler, and Charles was still in Houston, it was clear that their marriage was not going to continue. So then the mention of Charles's death came up, and everyone was tiptoeing around the discussion of Charles's death. And I knew that that was because there had been some limiting orders put in place in February, but they were sealed, so we weren't privy to what was in them. But I knew that there were some limiting instructions out there. So we're going to get into that later, because it comes up, and actually the prosecution did a very good job of getting all that stuff in. So Kay did say that she had called Lori and asked Lori whether JJ could come to Charles's memorial service. And Lori initially said yes, and then reneged and said no. And Kay was very disappointed that she wasn't able to go and pick up JJ and have him there for Charles's service. So the cross-examination was, John Thomas did it. It was fairly ginger. I mean, it was definitely a gentle cross-examination. Before I get to that, though, it was November of 2019 when it was October of 2019, when Kay was trying to hook up Charles's old printer. And somehow in the process, it connected to his Gmail account, and she was able to open up essentially his computer, and discovered that Lori was buying things on Charles's Amazon account and having them delivered to an address in Rexburg, Idaho. And that was the first time that Kay knew where JJ and Lori and Tylee had moved to. And she noticed that Lori had been browsing for wedding stuff. Now, this is October 2nd, 2019. She had bought silver malachite and malachite wedding rings and been browsing for beach wedding dresses and men's white linen clothing. So Kay started, Kay had been in contact with the police in Chandler, and now began contacting the police in Rexburg as well. So on cross-examination, John Thomas talked a bit about their Lori and Charles's relationship, their age difference, which was 17 years, and the benefit of having JJ in the Phoenix area. Kay did say, oh, I'm sorry, the date that she hooked up the printer was November 8th, which makes a lot more sense. She woke up at 4:30 in the morning. She'd been trying to get this printer hooked up and she couldn't get it to work. And 4:30 in the morning, she woke up and thought, I need to get up and take care of that. And that was when she discovered all the information on Charles's computer. And she felt that was divine intervention. The second witness was Brandon Boudreau. Now, those of you who may not be that familiar to the case, and it's a very convoluted family tree, so let me see if I can organize it for you. Brandon Boudreaux was married to Melanie Boudreaux, and Melanie Cope Boudreaux is Lori's niece. Lori had a sister named Stacy who died at age 31, and Melanie was a young child at that point, 8, 9 years old. And Lori became like a second mom to Melanie. So now Melanie is a grown woman. She's married and has children, and she's married to Brandon Boudreaux at that point. Brandon Boudreaux is on the stand talking about, first of all, about the family. He choked up talking about his son Braxton and JJ being close, and how much JJ looked up to Braxton, who was a bit older. He said JJ was obsessed with travel and he loved suitcases. And so Brandon said he watched Tylee grow up. Brandon actually baptized Tylee in the LDS church. A priesthood holder, any man who's been ordained with the priesthood can do ordinances, including baptism. And so Charles was still fairly new in the faith and wasn't feeling entirely comfortable with being the person to baptize Tylee. And so Brandon did it. Melanie Boudreaux and Lori had a really close, more like a mother-daughter relationship. And Brandon said that he and Charles Vallow were close. They all spent holidays together. Christmas 2018, things were different. Things were tense. They were strange. Melanie Gibb was there with somebody she didn't know. He didn't know. No one felt close. He also said that Melanie Boudreaux's activity in the church increased after because when they first got married, she didn't really like going to church, and he was the one who would have to sort of convince her that she needed to go to church on Sundays. He was the one who had to push her into doing it. But in the fall of 2018, she started getting really passionate about church and started going to firesides. They weren't the kind of firesides. The LDS church organizes these firesides, and they're like meetings, church meetings, like Bible studies in people's homes. But these were firesides that were not organized by the church. They were firesides that were sort of out of the mainstream church. But Melanie called them firesides, and they went and met in people's houses. She usually went with Lori Vallow, but Charles Vallow and Brandon, neither one were ever invited to these firesides. And Melanie started going to the temple. I'm going to pause for a minute and just talk about how things looked. And I do have a picture that I'll pull up for you. I forgot to pull it up before I got started, so I will do my best to pull that up and get it up so that people can understand how the courtroom is laid out. So I'll try and do that. But I do want to talk a little bit about what was going on in the courtroom. So first of all, the prosecution, and I am going to get back to going through the testimony here very shortly, but I do want to take a minute. Oops, I forgot. It's just going to take me 1 second to pull this up and pull it up for everybody to be able to see it. Unfortunately, StreamYard only does post PDF, so I had to change it over to a PDF. But so okay, we're almost there. and I'll pull that up in just a second. So the courtroom is arranged in kind of an odd way. Bear with me, I didn't flip this when I pulled it up, but I think you can all get the layout. The main door is behind the third, that center block of pews. So the main entrance is opposite where the judge's bench is. So when you come in the main entrance, there are 3 sections of spectators. And the center section has been set aside for witnesses and for the family members. So Larry and Kay are sitting there. Charles's former wife, Cheryl, and her 2 boys, or one of her sons, were there. Annie Cushing was there with her daughter. Several other, Jerry Vallow, and I'll think of the rest of them in a second. So then the prosecution's bench is really right in front of that witness list, because people are sitting in that front row and are able to, Detective Hermosillo's there. There's a couple of other people that are assisting the prosecution that are there, so they can hand them things. And so that whole front row is witnesses essentially, and other people helping the prosecution. So then the defense table is turned perpendicular, so that, I think that's the right thing to say, so that Lori and her defense team are facing the jury. So the jury can they have a direct line of sight with the defense. The lawyers go to the podium to the right of the prosecution's table, and the witnesses go up onto the witness stand to the right of the judge's bench. And there's a screen next to them where all of the exhibits are displayed. So what I thought was interesting was Rachel Smith was there. She wears a black jacket over whatever she's wearing for the day. And on that black jacket is a Lady Liberty pin. It's big. It's, and right on her lapel. And it just fascinated me. Different judges have different takes on things. The court conduct rules specifically said you couldn't wear photographs, you couldn't wear anything with a slogan or anything on it. People have been pretty circumspect about wearing their Tylee and JJ bracelets. So it was kind of interesting to me that here's this big honkin' Lady Liberty gold pin. So let's talk a little bit about how Lori's dressed, because I think that her attorneys really have done her a bit of a disservice. First day she came in, she was in black slacks and a blouse. I'm not sure which one. There's a pink one and a blue one, kind of powder blue, and a black cardigan sweater. I understand the courtroom can get chilly and maybe she needs a sweater. But as time has gone on, she has a white blouse she wears. She has a black, kind of very oversized, like a suit jacket. And then she has a few different pairs of pants. She came in one day in camouflage leggings. That was a little weird. And then on Friday, she showed up and she had on these kind of baggy, like almost like pajama bottoms. They were cotton, but kind of loose. And they were kind of a white color, and they had black tiger stripes all over them. Now, I think that lawyers have an obligation to make sure that their clients come to court presentable. Now, she doesn't have to come to court as a fashion maven, but she needs to come to court in a way that is not distracting and does not reflect poorly on her, because you want her to look like Jodi Arias like a librarian, and they've missed the mark. And I don't know if it's because they're all men and they don't have somebody who's helping them out with that, or what the deal is. But her mode of dress is not particularly helpful to her case, I don't think. So let's get back to Brandon Boudreaux. So Brandon Boudreaux said that Lori Vallow was very deeply involved in the crash of his marriage. He said that he had noticed that Lori's relationship was coming apart, Lori's relationship with Charles. And he said his relationship really kind of came apart in what he said. It went from 0 to 100 really quick. He didn't understand why suddenly she was going to the temple every day, even when they were on vacation. This is Melanie was doing that. And he had a big argument with her over not wanting to buy $10,000 worth of food storage. So things were quite different than they had been earlier in their marriage. So the next thing that happened is that they had an argument about attending his grandfather's funeral that deteriorated into these weird accusations. She started saying he'd hacked Lori Vallow's phone, hacked her computer, and then she started saying, "God told me you're gay." And it just sort of went downhill from there. And so they separated. And when it became clear that they were getting divorced, they went to a mediator and mediated a divorce settlement. Brandon talked a little bit sort of around the subject of Charles dying. So this was sort of interesting because the defense started complaining about the fact that they were trying to bring in Brandon Boudreaux had been shot at. And the prosecution said it's not to prove that Lori's a bad person. It is to prove that there was a common scheme or plan. And the judge allowed it. So all of that information came in about Brandon Boudreaux being shot at. I'm just checking my notes here. The prosecution said the evidence isn't a prior bad act. It's proof of a common scheme or plan. So Brandon described the shooting, which we all know was everyone believes was Alex Cox. He was driving the Jeep that had Texas plates and was in Charles Vallow's name that Tylee had always driven. Now, by the time this happens in early October, both Charles and Tylee are dead. Brandon says he was certain that it was Alex, and he was very suspicious. He was struggling to not say he was suspicious because Alex had previously shot Charles. So one of the things that I thought was particularly touching is that Brandon Boudreaux remarried. And the day his wedding was the day that the children's bodies were discovered. And when his wedding was over, he got in his car and he drove 12 hours straight from Chandler, Arizona to Rexburg. And the first thing he did was go check on Larry and Kay. And when he got there, Larry was really laid low, and they had a conversation about who was going to go and identify JJ's body. And Brandon said, "Let me do that for you. I don't want that to be your memory of him." And so Brandon went and did that identification. He was very choked up while he talked about that. So we they finished with Brandon. The defense had very minimal questions, and they finished with Brandon, and Detective Hermosillo was called to the stand. So they started with the Detective Hermosillo, and that was how we finished up the afternoon, was with the very beginning of Detective Hermosillo's testimony. Now, Detective Hermosillo was the lead detective from Rexburg PD, who really oversaw the Idaho portion of the investigation of the case. It was interesting because Detective Hermosillo said that they initially got involved because Chandler PD called them. Actually, Brandon Boudreaux's attempted shooting happened in Gilbert, which is just the community next door to Chandler. Gilbert PD called them and asked them to do some surveillance and to see whether they could find Tylee's Jeep. So they already had Lori Vallow and Chad Daybell and company sort of under some loose surveillance because they were looking for the Jeep. And so when Kay discovered they were in Rexburg and then called Rexburg police and said, "I want you to do a welfare check on JJ," Lori Vallow and Chad Daybell and all of that was already on their radar. Tammy Daybell had died. It seemed odd. They had done this surveillance. One of the things that comes out in one of the other officers' testimony is that the police in Rexburg or in, I think that is the Fremont County Sheriff, they were doing a little surveillance on Chad and Lori and following them a little bit, seeing them just a few days after Tammy's death, holding hands and canoodling and going in and out of Hobby Lobby together and having lunch together. And so they were already on law enforcement's radar before the wellness check was requested. Now, what law enforcement didn't know was that there were kids missing. They didn't know that up until the Kay called in the welfare check in late November. I want to say November 26th, so right around Thanksgiving. So when Hermosillo arrived at the complex where Lori and Alex and Melanie Boudreaux-Pulowski were all living, he pulled up and he stopped and knew that he was talking to Lori Vallow's brother Alex and Chad Daybell. He pulled up and said he was looking for JJ because JJ was going to do a welfare check. Alex and Chad both exchanged what he said was an absolute blank look. They were, I guess you'd say they were stunned that somebody would be looking for JJ. And they both kind of looked at one another like neither one of them really knew what to say. And then, so Hermosillo says Alex said he didn't have Lori's phone number because they were asking how to get a hold of Lori. Chad said he barely knew Lori. And But Hermosillo said, that's really strange because he already knew Lori and Chad had been married a couple of weeks before, or yeah, maybe a couple of weeks before. So Hermosillo thought the whole thing seemed really weird. And he decided wanted to go and get a warrant. So went to the prosecutor's office to go get the warrant. In the meantime, Lori Vallow called him back. There was another exchange where Chad finally said, yes, I have Lori's number, and gave it to Hermosillo. And they attempted to left a message for her. When they got to the prosecutor's office, Lori called them back. And they felt after talking to her that they didn't really have enough information to get a warrant. So then they went back, Detective Hope and Ball, that's when you see the body camera footage, go back and knock on Lori's door. She's expecting them because she's talked to him on the phone. And that's when you see that interview on the body camera footage. And after they have this exchange that is, to them, creates more questions than answers, they decide, in fact, they do need a warrant, and they go the next morning to get a warrant. When they come back, the apartments are all empty. Lori's apartment she's gone. The apartment is still full of stuff. There's still food in the refrigerator. There's food in the pantry. There's still belongings in the apartment, but all their clothes are gone. There is not a stitch of clothing. Everything's off the hangers and out of the closet. There's nothing in the closet but empty hangers. He thinks that's really strange. So then they go through the house. They get the search warrant, or they have the search warrant. They go through the house. In the process, they find a rental agreement for a storage unit, and they get a warrant, and they go and look in the storage unit as well. One of the things that's sort of interesting is, as they're going through Lori's house and they go through the garage, there's a lot of stuff in the garage. One of the weird things is, in the room that it appears Alex Cox is living in a room in Lori's apartment, even though he has his own apartment. It's all very confusing. Because they find a bunch of his belongings there, a tub with a bunch of his stuff in it. And so it appears that Alex is living there. And one of the things that they find in that room are two of those white Tyvek suits, those like hazmat suits, the ones, or the suits that painters wear. There's two of them, and they look new. So then they go through the garage, and they find all kinds of interesting stuff in the garage. They find black trash bags full of clothing. They find a whole tub of ammunition, several different guns, several different military-style knives, 2 silencers, a weird-looking rubber Halloween mask, a handgun in the case, Alex Cox's passport, a Walmart bag that has rope and duct tape inside, a bunch of documents, and so the other thing they find is a ghillie suit. Now, those of you who have followed my newsletter, I always say, grab your ghillie suit, because we're going to get in the weeds. But a ghillie suit is one of those camouflage suits that makes you look like a bush. There was one of those in there. So then they discover through a tip that Lori is in Hawaii. By this time, they know they have missing children. And by this time, they've gotten the court to issue an order directing Lori to produce the children to prove that they're okay. So Hermosillo goes to Hawaii and helps serve that warrant, that order. And while he's there, the Hawaii police get a search warrant and they search Lori's rental car. And they're looking for proof of life for both children. They find in Lori's garage in Rexburg, they find all the emails from Chad Daybell, a lot of them having to do with like the dark and light scale and who's dark and who's light, and they start looking through Lori's iCloud account. So they find out that they discover that the last time that they can prove they have any indication of JJ being alive, it is September 8th of 2019, and it is a photograph of him sitting on the couch in Lori's apartment, eating what appears to be yogurt in red pajamas. The date and time stamp indicate the metadata, as they call it, the date and time information on the photo indicates that it was taken on that early evening of that last day. The last indication that they have of, I'm sorry, JJ is September 22nd, 2019. The last indication they have of Tylee alive is a photograph of her and JJ and Alex Cox at Yellowstone National Park, and that is on September 8th of 2019. So they serve search warrants on Chad and Lori's property in Hawaii, the place where they were living, and they also and then Lori violates the court's order to produce the children. The judge issues a pickup order, a warrant for her, and she is arrested in Hawaii and extradited back to Rexburg. That is in February of 2020. Now, anybody who has seen that footage can see that it is cold in Rexburg in February. There's snow on the ground, and there will continue to be snow on the ground until sometime in May. So they continue. Lori's in jail on $1 million bond on the original charges of her failing to produce her children and abandoning her children and lying to police. In the meantime, law enforcement keeps plugging along on this investigation, including doing lots of extractions on everyone's telephones. And then on June 9th of 2020, now that the ground is no longer frozen, Detective Hermosillo and a couple of other officers knock on Chad Daybell's door at 7 a.m. Mark Daybell comes to the door with a bowl of cereal in his hand and answers the door. They explain to him that they're there to serve a search warrant, and he says, "My dad is still asleep." They go into Chad Daybell's bedroom, which is upstairs in a loft above the garage, and they walk in, and Chad is still asleep. And they wake Chad up, and they explain to him what they're doing. He gets dressed, follows them into the kitchen, and calls Mark Means. He has a conversation with Mark Means. Mark Means wanted to talk to the detective, but Hermosillo said, "Call the prosecutor if you want to talk to somebody." It's not quite clear who of Chad Daybell's children were there. Hermosillo talked about the fact that some of his children were there. They were allowed to leave. Chad said he wasn't sure if he would stay or go, and went out into his car to make a phone call. So he was in his car He was told he could stay on the property, as is typical with a search warrant, as long as he was accompanied by an officer for officer safety. So for the remainder, he sat in his car. His car was backed into the driveway, and there were quite a few pictures. There were some Google Earth pictures, some aerial photos. So there was a lot of illustrations of the layout of the exterior of the property. As soon as the search warrant was served and the property had been secured, then the FBI evidence recovery team descended on the property. And they showed up on the property ready to go to work. Picks, shovels, tarps, tents, a backhoe, cadaver dogs, and they started setting up. The Idaho Attorney General was there. Fremont Sheriff's Office was there, along with the FBI and the Rexburg Police and Madison County Sheriff. And so Detective Hermosillo went over to ask Chad if he needed a coat because he was outside and it was still chilly in the mornings. And he was on the phone. So Hermosillo stood next to Chad's car, was able to see where Chad was looking. Chad kept looking back over his shoulder, kind of running his hands through his hair nervously, looking back over his shoulder. When Hermosillo stood in that same spot, what Chad was looking at was the pond and the tree where JJ was buried. So Hermosillo was assigned initially to sift through the fire pit. And so the ERT team brought out these big sifters and they put dirt into them and they shook them and sifted out all of the material from the fire pit. In the fire pit, they found bone shards and teeth. And as they were continuing to do that, they were also pulling up the first layer of sod in the area under the tree next to the pond. Hermosillo showed some pictures, or the prosecution entered into evidence pictures of the area and what sort of got their attention. And what got their attention was that the roots of the tree had been cut previously, and that there was also a difference in the texture and the length of the grass around that area. So it looked like it had been disturbed, and it was the area that had been disturbed was a square. So they started to pull that up. They pulled up the first level of grass and topsoil and turf, and then Detective Hermosillo was called from the fire pit to go over to what ultimately turned out to be JJ's burial location. So now this is information we have heard before, and I don't want to get overly graphic, but I think it is important to the story. There are some important things to know. When the emergency recovery team or the evidence recovery team scraped the first level of dirt off of, pulled up the sod and then scraped the first level of soil, they found these flat paver rocks. They looked like patio pavers. And there were several of them, 3 of them, flat paver rocks. And so when they removed those, that was the point that they could start to smell the odor of a decomposing body. Now, anyone who has ever been around that odor will tell you it is very distinctive. And Ray Hermosillo, as he testified in the preliminary hearing, has been a detective a long time and has responded to unaccompanied deaths on many occasions. So he began assisting with that and was there watching and assisting with that process. So the next thing that they pulled up was a thin layer of what looked like wall paneling, like old wood wall paneling. And under that, the soil was very moist, which is indicative of decomposition. And they could begin to see the very top of what appeared to be black plastic sticking out. As they continued to dig around that, it was round. And so as they started to dig that out, it became more and more evident that it was a head. And they were able to dig away all of the. So the next thing that they did was somebody took a scalpel and cut open the black plastic. Underneath was a white garbage bag, one of those stretchy waffle garbage bags with the red drawstring. And so when they cut that open, they could see brown hair. So they finished excavating the entire black plastic bag. It was small. It was evident it was a child's body. And Deputy Hermosillo said he assisted in taking JJ's body out of the grave. And I thought what was really telling was both of these remains were so small. Tylee's because there was so little of it left. JJ's because he was so little, that they didn't need to bring a stretcher in from the coroner's office. They just picked it up and carried it in their arms. And it's very sad. So at this point, we were getting a few photographs. Hermosillo's photographs primarily were of the burial area for JJ, and they were sort of photographs of the process as they were going through. They photographed the white rocks, photographed the wood, photographed the dirt, and so as they were going down through the layers, photographed the body wrapped in black plastic and duct tape. There were not particularly graphic images at that point. But it was still hard to see. No doubt about it. The jury members looked troubled. Everyone looked disturbed. So then Hermosillo said after JJ's body was recovered and put into a body bag in the coroner's van, he then went back to the fire pit to help with the recovery around the fire pit. By that time, they had begun to excavate around the area around the fire pit and had discovered a buried mass of charred flesh. And the more they dug, the more difficult it was. This mass was sort of just in there where it was falling apart. When they tried to lift it out, they dug around it and carefully lifted it out and onto a tarp. What they found underneath was a melted green plastic bucket. So it appeared that the remains had at some point been put into this bucket and attempted to be burned. When they removed the bucket, they found a partial skull and a jawbone. So they removed all those things. Hermosillo said, and Hermosillo he's a cool cop, but you could tell that it was a hard recovery for him. What he said was that the officers, him included, that were there working on this site, they could only work for a couple of minutes. They were working with little archaeology tools like small trowels and paintbrushes, and they could only work at the site a couple of minutes because the smell was so overpowering, and they would have to leave, and then they would have to come and spell whoever else was in there. So it was a very painstaking and difficult recovery. That night, the scene was roped off and was secured around the clock with patrol. And they went back the next day to complete the excavation of Tylee's body. So that night, they took their remains to the local hospital morgue where they were stored overnight. The next day, Hermosillo and Brenda Dye, who was the coroner, and two other officers, their names are in my notes, but I don't want to take the time to look for them, drove from Rexburg to Boise, which is about 4 hours, to bring the remains to the Ada County Medical Examiner's office. And they brought the remains to the ME's office, and then the ME started with JJ's remains. They were photographed as they conducted the autopsy, and prior to that was about the point when Hermosillo said he and the rest of the officers took the remains to Ada County. By the time they got there, it was after hours, and so the autopsy wasn't until the next morning. That was when the judge said, let's take our lunch break. It was a little bit early, but I think the judge just wanted to break up this really graphic testimony. So we take our lunch break, we come back, reconvene in the courtroom, and the judge says, the prosecution has an issue that, the first thing that happens is that the defense team comes in and the security people bring Lori in. She has been, the first week or so, she was being brought into court in shackles and being shackled to the floor. The last couple days that hasn't happened, but I'm certain that they have some other form of security, because there are all kinds of security devices that they can use that are not apparent to the jury. So the judge says we need to take a break because the defense asks, can we please have a few minutes with Lori? Now, a lot of people noticed that just before lunch, Lori was looking upset, angry, had her arms folded. And so when she came back in, they said, we need to talk to her. So they took her back out into the judge's chambers and they had a conversation. A few minutes later, they came in and invited the prosecution's attorneys to go back there as well. Then court security, the bailiff came out and said, this is going to take a little longer than we thought, so we're going to take a 30-minute break. So we took a 30-minute break. In the meantime, everybody is buzzing. I mean, everybody's like, what does this mean? Is she going to take a plea? Is she not competent anymore? What's going on? Everybody's just, I mean, everything anybody can think about. Is there a problem with the jury? Is that, I mean, all the things that come to mind when this trial is just stopped. So it turns out they come back on the record, and the judge says, and the jury is sent out. So they argue this out of the hearing of the jury. And the judge says, Ms. Vallow has requested to have her presence waived for the rest of the afternoon because her attorneys say that she's very disturbed by the descriptions and the images that she's seen. Well, the prosecution objects, and they say, the people have a right to have her here, and the victims have a right to have her here, and we want her in the courtroom. And so the judge talks through a bit of a legal analysis and ultimately orders that she has to remain in the courthouse, or in the courtroom, where she will have to be present and see all those images the same as everyone else. Lori sits down, crosses her arms, and looks absolutely livid. She is furious. And So the afternoon goes on, and now the really hard images come. So Hermosillo, the prosecution offers into evidence several photographs. They're up on a screen for the entire room to be able to see. They're broadcast into the overflow room. So they're not doing any of the precautions they did in Murdoch. And so the first image that comes up is an image of JJ as he appeared after they took all of the plastic off, and his body was wrapped in layers and layers of duct tape. I think it was an important picture because it was very hard to get them to understand when, if you heard Chad's preliminary hearing, Hermosillo described all this duct tape and how odd it was. But it's one thing to have it described, it's another to see a picture. His head was literally wrapped in duct tape to the point where he looked like he had a space helmet on. And also his arms were wrapped in duct tape until they were just a big mass of like silver mitts. So, and he was wearing his red pajamas, which was really, really hurt my heart. So the next image that was shown, the prosecution was talking about how Hermosillo had identified JJ. And Hermosillo had said, "Yeah, I'm pretty sure it's him. I'm certain it's him." And the prosecution said, "How did you know?" And he said, "Well, I've seen so many pictures of him, and even with the deterioration of the body, it was still very obviously him." And so that was when they showed a close-up photograph of JJ's head and shoulders, and it is very obviously him. And at that point, I could hear Larry Woodcock sobbing, and it was very quiet. And when I looked over at the jury, some were wiping their eyes. A couple of the men were also wiping their eyes. Several of them looked angry, like very angry. One of them, I think if he could have come over the jury box at her, he might have. It was awful. Now, somebody asked me, how bad was it? And I am not a good person to judge that. Because for 27 years, I did this kind of work. So I had to say to somebody, is it the worst I've ever seen? No. But I have to say that I am certain that it was the worst things the jury had ever seen. So, and that was without a doubt the worst of the pictures. The autopsy was continued, and the rest of the questions really had to do with the process of preserving all that evidence. I will tell you that Kay Woodcock came in right after lunch. The victim's assistant person sort of was whispering to them about what was going on, why court was delayed, what Lori wanted. And Kay and Larry both knew that Lori didn't want to be there. They both had really angry, disgusted sort of expressions. And then Kay left. And only Larry was there when these pictures were shown. The medical examiner advised them that it wouldn't be possible for them to evaluate or or do any sort of evaluation of Tylee's remains, and ultimately they were sent to the FBI's crime lab. It was particularly hard to watch. It was hard to watch Larry. He was bent over at one point over his knees, sobbing, and that was hard. Throughout it all, Lori was talking to her attorney, to Jim Archibald. She seems to talk more to Jim Archibald than she does to John Thomas. And she appeared more angry than upset. And so John Thomas did the cross-examination. It was pretty perfunctory. I mean, he poked holes at, gee, Hermosillo, you'd only been a deputy a year when you got this case. How did you really get involved? You know, were you looking for the Jeep? I mean, it was all pretty cursory, really. The whole time, Lori had swiveled her chair so that her back was to the witnesses in the gallery. And then as John Thomas went on, sort of droning along, she started to droop. And at first I wasn't sure if she was asleep, but it became evident that she fell asleep. Now, Lori is taking a cocktail of psychotropic drugs. I don't know what that looks like, but it is possible that that had something to do with it. And she actually, later in the afternoon, nodded off. So that was the end of that day. It was very emotional, very difficult. And on we went to Wednesday. Wednesday saw the first thing that happened, and I do want folks to know this. The first thing that happened was the court came in and said, the judge came in and said, the prosecution has something that's arisen and there's a problem. And we're going to adjourn early today because of that. And at first it didn't quite add up, but it became evident very quickly that it was a personal issue with one of the prosecutors and that Lindsay Blake wasn't present. So the prosecution went on. They called Detective Harmon, who was, they finished the cross on Detective Hermosillo. I can't even read my own notes. Not Harmon, Hermosillo. And their redirect was really brief. They asked some silly questions like, did you find any other boards that match the board in JJ's burial site on Chad's property? And Hermosillo said no, that they didn't. They found similar things, but nothing that matched. Then wow, they're watching a movie out there now, and it's loud. Anyway, so if you hear Top Gun in the background, that's what's going on. The cross-examination was very brief. He asked Hermosillo about evidence collection at the autopsy. Hermosillo said, that wasn't my job. I was just there to observe. And once again, we had a couple of jurors who were really shooting Lori angry daggers from their eyes. Then there was a discussion about the paintball gun which Hermosillo called an attempted homicide, and John Thomas objected to it being, didn't object, but push back on being called an attempted homicide. So that was the end of Hermosillo's examination, and the next witness was Jared Wilmore. He's a Madison County Sheriff Office captain, and he's the head of the jail. And he answered questions about how the jail operates, how inmates use Telmate, how they can use video or audio or both. Phone and video, that phone and video visits are all recorded, and laid the foundation for the admission of several calls. The first one was the June 9th, 2020 call between Chad and Lori. And that one was played. Then he also introduced a June 24th, 2020 video visit between Lori and her sister, Summer Shiflett, as well as an August 3rd, 2020 video visit that Lori had with her son, Colby. So that was very interesting because those two, the one with Summer and the one with Colby, weren't played, but they were admitted. So I'm sure we're going to see them probably when Lori and Colby, or when Summer and Colby testified. The next witness was Lieutenant Joe Powell from Fremont County. And he was the one who talked about the surveillance that was done on Lori and Chad after Tammy's death. And he was the one who got the court order and organized Tammy Daybell's exhumation. So Tammy Daybell, when she died, there was not an autopsy done because the family declined one. And her body was embalmed, transported from Rexburg to Springville, Utah, where she was buried. She was actually buried in the same cemetery where Chad had been the cemetery sexton. So they had to get a court order, they had to get a Utah court order, and they had to go through all of these, jump through a lot of legal hoops in order to have Tammy's body exhumed. Tammy's body was exhumed. Officer Powell showed the prosecution introduced a whole series of photos through Officer Powell, who was there and supervised the exhumation. So there's a series of photos of the grave being dug up, of the concrete vault open where you can see the coffin, and then the empty grave, and then there is a photo of that was taken at Tammy's autopsy. He got Tammy's medical records to explore whether or not she was having some sort of health problems. She didn't go to the doctor very often, but there were only two prescriptions, one for fluoxetine, which is Prozac, and tramadol, which is a non-narcotic pain medication. And so he was suspicious because Chad Daybell had gone right on to marry Lori 17 days later. And in fact, he had information that the day after Tammy's funeral, Chad had moved into Lori's townhouse. So there was a photograph of Tammy. It was not awful. She looked fairly peaceful. She was in her temple clothes, which faithful LDS members are buried in. She was in her white temple clothes with a green apron on. Women are buried in a veil, and they had pulled the veil back. But it wasn't particularly graphic in any it wasn't all that disturbing. Tammy's autopsy was done, and she was returned to her eternal rest within about 6 hours. And in fact, some of the family didn't even know it had happened until after it was all done. So there was no cross-examination for him, and that was the end of that day because they ended early. The prosecution released a statement, and we have later found out that Lindsay Blake's father died suddenly and very unexpectedly, and the court has said that there will be no court on Monday, so that the prosecution team can attend his funeral. So then we have Thursday. So Thursday, we all pile into the courthouse and get through court security and get our seats in the courtroom. And lo and behold, this has been sort of maddening because the court has not released the witness statement. So we never know until we get there who the next witness is going to be until they're called. And lo and behold, Melanie Gibb's in the house. Lindsay Blake was back. She was poised and continuing to do her work in spite of a really difficult time for her. I really felt for her. Melanie Gibb came in. It was clear she was very nervous. Her movements were really wooden and sharp. It was almost like she was marching and doing about faces. And so she came to the front of the courtroom, raised her hand. I mean, her hand was just like sharp, and her elbow was sharp, and was sworn in and went to the witness statement. She was wearing a V-necked short sleeve sweater, black, and skirt, kind of a slim fitting skirt, but the bottom of it was a handkerchief hem, so it was a little floaty, and black knee-high boots. She sat down in the witness station and the witness box, and the prosecution started to question her. Now, I've gone on for almost an hour and a half. We're not even close to questions, so I don't want to belabor this. There was not a lot more that she was able to add to the facts. Neither she nor Zulema added a lot to what we didn't already know. But there were some important things that Zulema talked about that I do want to talk about. So I don't want to discount Melanie Gibb's testimony, but I will say that she didn't add a lot to the testimony she gave at the preliminary hearing for Chad. She did say she'd known Chad for 1 or 2 years, that she'd met him at conferences, and they kind of had a passing acquaintance. She did say that Lori and Tylee seemed to have a troubled kind of a relationship. Tylee was often very frustrated and annoyed with her mom, and that Tylee was pretty disrespectful. She said that sometimes Lori was very patient and loving with JJ, and other times she was very distracted and frustrated. And that as time went on, Lori got more distracted and frustrated and less interested and patient with JJ. They saw one another frequently, sometimes daily, and they went to the temple together very frequently. It was in October of 2018 that Lori and Melanie and 4 other women, including Zulema, all piled into a car to take a trip to Utah from Arizona to St. George, Utah, to this Preparing a People conference. She was with Lori when Lori met Chad. He was very friendly. They engaged in discussions about their beliefs, and Lori was clearly attracted. She was flirty. She was flattered, and Lori spent most of the rest of the conference around Chad's book table and anywhere Chad was. In the process of that meeting, Chad Daybell told Lori that he believed they had been married in a past probation and that he had been James the Lesser and she had been his wife, Elena. Lori Vallow, Melanie Gibb did say that she thought that Lori Vallow already believed in multiple probations. And so she felt that some of what Chad was saying was just validating what Lori thought, because Lori had already told Melanie that she had been married to Moroni in a past life. Melanie Gibbs said after that, she and Chad were talking frequently, sometimes several times a day. And and the prosecution made the point that that was while both of their spouses were still living. 2 weeks after that meeting, Daybell came to Arizona for preparing a people conference and stayed at Lori's house while Charles Vallow was out of town. In fact, Zulema says that Lori asked Charles to be out of town because she was going to have a bunch of friends over while they were here for the conference. And there were several people who stayed at Lori's home that weekend, including Chad. And then there was some discussion about the progression of Lori's beliefs as she and Chad got better acquainted and more involved. It was clear that she started out saying she was in the 144,000, later said that she and Chad were the leaders of the 144,000. And Melanie said that initially she was sharing these beliefs with Zulema, Serena Sharp, Christina Atwood, a woman named Nicole, and then later with Summer and with Alex Cox. These ideas were never shared with Brandon or with Charles Vallow, and that Chad started introducing his light and dark scale, and that the light equaled Jesus, the dark equaled Satan, and you could sign a contract in the pre-mortal world to decide whether or not you would follow Jesus or you would follow Satan. It wasn't until January of 2019 when Melanie Gibbs says that Chad told Lori that Charles Vallow had been possessed by a demon, by an evil spirit. And this was the first time that Melanie Gibb had heard anything about demon possession. And in fact, she believed it was the first time that Lori had heard anything about people being possessed, because she was pretty thrown off by it. She was told that Charles Vallow had been taken over by a demon whose name is Garrett. Lori Vallow then said she had a dream, and in that dream, Charles Vallow had died in a car accident. And she said it was because, and she was convinced it was going to happen while he was on a trip, a business trip. When it didn't happen, Lori said it was because Satan interfered with the plan. And she shared that a plan was revealed to them that Charles and Tammy Daybell both had to die so they could be together. Melanie asked why they didn't just get divorced, and Lori said it was because Chad would lose his exaltation and would be punished for if they got divorced. She talked a bit about castings. Now, I'm going to talk a lot more about castings when I get to Zulema's testimony. So brace yourself, because it appears that we're going to go long, and I really do want to leave time for all your questions. So I can see in the chat that Michelle's going through and marking the questions. So we are going to take questions, and if we go longer than 2 hours, it's okay. During all of this discussion, the jury looked kind of incredulous, sort of like, what in the world are they talking about? Um, Melanie talked about the fact that Chad said that when a person's spirit was forced out of its body by a demon spirit or an evil spirit, that the person's soul then um, was stuck in spirit prison or in kind of a limbo. And once the original spirit's out of the body's still alive because the demon is in possession of the body. She also said that they believe that there is this 2-second window from the time you force a spirit out when before another spirit can take over the body. They believed that they had done these castings to cast out Ned Snyder, but then first it was Garrett, they cast him out, then Ned Snyder, they cast him out, and then this very powerful demon called Iplos, because the H is silent, came and took over Charles's body. Weeks later, they started calling these people zombies. Lori was present for all the castings. Chad Daybell was present at one, but Melanie thought that Charles was already dead by that time, so she thinks it probably was for Brandon Boudreaux. Lori Vallow said Brandon was dark, that he became a high-level dark and had been in another life, had been part of Hitler's regime. Charles, Brandon, Adam, Lori's father, Barry, Tylee, Kay, and JJ were all dark. And there were random people who were in law enforcement. Melanie was vague on whether Tammy Daybell was she was vague on Tylee because Lori said that an evil spirit had entered Tylee when she was 12 or 13, and then later said Lori had told Melanie that it had happened earlier that year. Melanie Gibb said the first time Lori had ever said that JJ was possessed was when Melanie got to Rexburg in September. Melanie was at Lori's house before Charles Vallow died, and Lori told her that she needed to leave. This was a little bit brilliant, I think, on the part of the prosecution. Because what they did was now we had this evidentiary ruling that said you can't bring in on any of those prior bad acts to prove character. So they were being very ginger about how they were talking about Charles Vallow. Then they asked Melanie, what did Lori say happened to Charles Vallow? Well, now even though it would potentially be hearsay, it's a statement of a party, so it comes in under the hearsay rule. And Melanie proceeded to talk all the stuff about Charles Vallow, that he'd been shot. You could have knocked the jury's eyes off with a stick when Melanie Gibb said that Charles had been shot by Alex, and then the whole story came out. So the whole story about how Charles died and Alex's role and all of that came out. The one thing that they are precluded from saying is that Lori has been charged, because that makes it seem like, well, she's been charged, so she must be guilty. So that didn't come in, but all of the other information about Alex's role, about Charles dying, about Charles, one of the shots being after Charles was on the ground, all of that stuff came in. And it was clear that the jury was appalled. So then Melanie said Lori had told her that it was difficult to deal with JJ and do her mission at the same time. She said she was going to ask Kay to take him. She said she was going to tell Kay she had breast cancer and that she couldn't take care of JJ and that Kay needed to take JJ. But as we all know, that didn't happen. Melanie Gibb went to Idaho in the weekend that JJ disappeared. And so they went through all of that information, which is information we've heard before at Chad's preliminary hearing. Lori said, Lori told Melanie Gibb that Tylee was at BYU-I, that's the BYU Idaho campus in Rexburg, living with friends. Lori Vallow never saw or heard. Melanie said she never saw or heard any evidence of Tylee, and in the whole time they were there, Lori never brought Tylee up. The only time it came up was when Melanie asked. So Melanie Gibb was on the stand most of the day. And they played the recording of her, the telephone call that she recorded between her and Lori and Chad. They played that recording. They talked to Melanie Gibb about the last time she'd seen JJ, and that was the night. She told the story of how David Warwick woke up from a nightmare and was very upset, and she went to get Lori to get a blessing, and Lori's door was locked and she wouldn't answer the door. They talked about Tammy Daybell's death, and actually there's more interesting things to be said about that in Zulema's testimony. John Thomas cross-examined, and again, it was sort of limited. He complained that Melanie Gibb had met with the prosecution to prepare for her testimony, and the prosecution hadn't notified them. It's a silly objection. I don't know what he's trying to do with it. I don't know if he's trying to make an appellate record of an issue that he's trying to get the Supreme Court to decide. I don't know, because technically the prosecution does not have to tell the defense if they meet with a witness unless there's any new information that comes out of the meeting. So the prosecution said there was no new information. You have all the reports. There was really no reason for us to let you know that we had met with her to go over her testimony for trial. Prosecutors meet with witnesses all the time. So Melanie Gibb went mostly through that rest of that day. I am looking at all my notes. They talked a lot about their beliefs and about the castings. And I'm going to get into that when we talk about Zulema. So I'm kind of whipping through that right now. She admitted that Tylee didn't like her and that they didn't get along. It was really interesting watching the jury learn about all these odd beliefs, learn about about Charles Vallow's death, learn about all the visions and all the spouses dying and all the castings. They looked pretty shocked. Let's see. So that was the rest of Thursday. Late on Thursday, they called Detective Nathan Duncan from the Chandler PD, and he he did all of the extractions of all of the iCloud and telephone accounts of Lori, Charles, Alex, I think, and he was also the second deputy in charge of the investigation into Charles's death. So now that the door's been opened on this, we get all of the detail of Charles's murder. We get every step of the Charles's murder and of the investigation. And we get all of the text messages that went back and forth between Lori and Chad, Lori and Alex, Lori and Zulema, Lori and Melanie. So we got a bunch of texts and emails. We saw the letter that Chad, that Lori supposedly the one that she said was from Charles wanting Chad to ghostwrite his book. We heard Chad's telephone call to the funeral home asking about cremation for Charles. We heard, and that was the first time that we heard anybody call Charles's death a murder. And this officer certainly said it more than once. One of the things we heard was the patriarchal blessing that Chad gave to Alex Cox on the 24th of November of 2019. So just a couple weeks before he died. Wow, we have over 1,000 people in chat. And that's a first for us. We have never had that many people in chat. So thank you so much. While you are here, please hit the like button. It helps us tremendously. And if you are not subscribed, please subscribe, because I'm trying to do as many quick little shorts from the courthouse as I can. And you're not going to get notified of those unless you're subscribed to the channel. Wow, thank you so much. I also want to remind everybody that we don't ask for donations. We don't ask that you super chat in order to get your question answered. We answer as many questions as we can. However, if you are generous enough to donate a super chat or through our PayPal account, all of those proceeds go to our moderators, who do a bang-up job and who I couldn't do this without. One of our moderators is also handling all of the social media. We have a Facebook page. It's called The Good Lori. It's a Facebook group, actually, called The Good Lori, where she is reposting all of my tweets, my live tweets from court. So check that out if you get a chance. Back to the patriarchal blessing. We had seen the written Microsoft Word version of this patriarchal blessing. We had not heard it, and there actually was a recording. Everybody's crying. Chad's crying, Lori's crying, Alex is crying, and they're getting this he's getting this patriarchal blessing. He's being praised for all the things that he has done for them, and being told that he is a warrior, that all of his sins have been forgiven. Chad says, "Well done, thy soul is cleansed." And Chad tells Alex he will be resurrected. So Friday, that ended Thursday, and Friday we started back with Officer Duncan, who was still going through all the text messages and the extractions from all the phones and the iCloud and all kinds of things. There were several PowerPoint exhibits that were summaries of all of these text messages. So We went through all of those messages. One of the things that is interesting is on the 1st of August, Alex is creating and setting up Lori's router in her apartment. And he texts her and says, here's the new username and password. The username is anti-Layman. Well, if you know the Book of Mormon, you know that the Lamanites were the bad guys and the Nephites were the good guys. And so the username is anti-Layman, and the password is the number 2 and the words many kids, too many kids. And he sends that text to Lori, and Lori's response is funny. Don't know what that means. Funny. He goes through the text messages about Lori not getting Charles's insurance, and through a number of other text messages. I mean, there are text after text of everything from she and Zulema talking about sending fire to Charles because he's driving and they want to cause an accident, to the email to Chad Daybell from a woman named Karen. That was a pretext email that was created by Lori Vallow, inviting Chad Daybell to go to Houston to speak at a youth conference. And that was a ploy to get Chad out of the house. So now we get to Zulema, who comes the very next day or later that day. Zulema comes in. She's dressed in a business suit, gray jacket and skirt. There's some conversation about whether or not they're going to bring up her 25-year-old drug conviction. They decide they're not going to. And she comes in with her lawyer, Garrett Smith, who is the same lawyer that Brandon Boudreaux sued for libel and won $12 million from. But that's another episode. And she says she met Lori Vallow in the fall of 2018 at Melanie Gibb's house at a fireside, where Lori was telling people that she was visited by angels regularly and that she had seen Jesus in live and physical form. Zulema said that gives people a lot of high spiritual standing, because that's the highest spiritual experience a human can have. She talked about going to St. George with Lori, and talked about the sort of instantaneous connection with Chad. She says that as they were driving home, Lori was driving and asked the rest of the women in the car to look up James the Less. Look up in scripture James the Less, because she wanted to find out who that was in the Bible, because that's who Chad Daybell said he had been when Lori had been married to him. Zulema got into a lot of the castings, and the one in particular that was of interest was the fact that they all gathered. Lori's attorneys have filed this notice of alibi that says Lori wasn't in town when Tammy Daybell died. And so Zulema said that Lori had flown from Rexburg to Arizona and was in Arizona staying at Zulema's house when Tammy Daybell was shot at on October 9th. Now, you'll remember that she was shot at and wasn't injured, and then 10 days later died. So she's shot at, and during that time, Lori and Zulema and the group of their friends are holding a casting to cast out the evil spirit from Tammy Daybell. All the time they're doing this casting. At the end, Lori calls Chad to find out whether or not their casting worked. Now, Lori's done this before with while they were casting the evil spirits out of Charles. And so she calls Chad to find out whether the casting worked. And what Zulema says is that she can hear Lori on the phone. She is very, very scary angry. She is huffing around, saying things like moron, idiot. And finally, she says, that idiot can't do anything right unless somebody's with him. And she's furious. Well, that is the very night that Alex took shots at Tammy and missed. So it's clear that this is all part of a common scheme and plan to get rid of these people's spouses so they can live happily ever after. They continue to try doing these castings. Nothing really works. One of the interesting things that comes in is the prosecutor asked Zulema about whether or not she knew anything about Lori and Charles Vallow having money problems. And Zulema says, yes, that she had heard they'd had money problems, but Lori had said she'd just come into some money that was going to help them with the problems because she had been the beneficiary of Tylee's dad's life insurance. That elicits an objection from John Thomas, and the judge sustains the objection, but the jury has already heard that Lori's third husband is also dead, which I thought was pretty interesting. Zulema goes through a lot of the same information, sort of confirming many of the things that Melanie Gibb said. She did not at this point talk anything about her relationship with Alex or their marriage or what may have happened there. And she just finished her testimony. We heard rumors that Colby was in the courthouse. It is not something that I could confirm. We heard it from Gigi and I heard it from a couple of different people. Neither one of us actually saw Colby, so we don't know for sure. But there was the buzz in the courthouse that Colby was there. Now, we'd heard rumors that he was there before, and it wasn't him. So, and until he shows up, we're not going to jump to conclusions. However, the prosecution has already introduced the jail call between Lori and Colby, which makes us suspicious that perhaps he could be their next witness. So, no court on Monday. I'm going to be on, and I'm going to take your questions here in just a second, but I'm going to be on Surviving the Survivor with Joel Waldman on Monday, 7 p.m. Eastern time. And I am going to be on Tuesday with Harvard lawyer Lee at 7 p.m. Eastern. And we'll get those links out to you. So I'm really excited that I keep getting invited back to these great creators, and it's been super fun. So with that, my voice is getting tired. I'm going to have a sip, and we're going to start taking some questions. Now, my dears, we've had 2 hours to collect questions. I know we're not going to get to them all, please, if you don't get frustrated, just put them in the comments down here or send them to my email, and I will do my very best to respond to them. I can't guarantee that I'm going to get back to them as quick as I usually would being in court all day, but I'll do my very best for you. Melanie 9, is it legal to tell half-truths and omit things on the stand? What are the legal ramifications? Forgot to state my question as a question initially and restating. Well, it is legal to not tell the whole truth or to leave things out. It just is. Laura Greer, I cannot believe what you just did. It came up in the chat in red. I couldn't miss it. Thank you so much for being so generous to our moderators. It really does make a huge difference for them. So thanks so much. Back to the question. It is legal, it is not perjury, to omit information or to skirt the truth. So it is legal to do that, and it's the responsibility of the attorney questioning to suss that out, to tease out the facts of the case and the facts of that bit of evidence. So it's really there. That's where cross-examination comes in, is to say, well, did you really mean, you sure you don't? So it is legal. I might lose my voice tonight before I get through all the questions. Diabolical 58. Some of your screen names just crack me the heck up. Thank you too for your super chat. Question: did Alex have a job or a career? How did he make money being Lori's puppet? Well, Alex had a few careers. He was a wannabe stand-up comic. He was essentially a truck driver. So he did delivery driving work, he did long haul trucking, and he also worked for a company that emptied porta potties. He drove the big tank truck that pumped out the porta potties. So he had quite a few different jobs. We understand that he also was trained as a massage therapist, but because he couldn't behave himself, that career didn't last very long. So he did have some kind of a job that kept the wolf from the door, because being Lori's puppet probably wasn't all that lucrative. It didn't prove to be all that lucrative, let's put it that way. You guys got some fun questions tonight. Beverly Alford. It's struck me each time Detective Hermosillo spoke of the human remains they unearthed on Chad's land, he referred to them as Tylee and JJ, never as the bodies. I was touched by his show of humanity. Well, I will say, I've seen Deputy Hermosillo testify on two occasions, one at Chad's preliminary and then one here in person. I've also seen him at every hearing about this case, every hearing in Rexburg, every hearing, he's been there. And I think that says a lot. I'm sure that the prosecution had this conversation with him, that they're attempting as much as possible to humanize these victims, as well they should. But I think that Detective Hermosillo genuinely cares about this case. And I think that it has been a case that has stuck with him and that he has a personal investment in. And he strikes me as a good guy. Now, I'm going to tell you something funny. He is a lot shorter than I thought he was. He's a big, broad-shouldered guy. And from about the waist up, you'd think he's about 6 feet tall. And he's not. He's not very tall at all. And it's a little bit amusing. It sort of conjured up for me the prince in Shrek that looks really tall until he gets off his horse. That's not to say anything bad about Detective Hermosillo, because he is a stand-up guy and he has done a great job on this case, and he has been super devoted to the case. So I agree that I think he is a good guy, and that he has been, that this case has affected him. There's no question. There were actually a couple of times when I felt like he was pretty close to choking up. Janet, any indication of how the jury perceived Zulema's willingness to pray for Charles and Tammy's death? No. I think they were still trying to process all of this information, and it was information that was pretty foreign. I think that it was interesting that the prosecution asked Melanie Gibb whether at any of the castings they had done, if they had ever prayed for Tylee and JJ, and she said no. And Melanie Gibb made it clear that Tylee and JJ didn't come up much, that they were not subjects of interest for Lori, that she was all in on all of this spiritual warfare stuff, and that the kids were just not important to that. Hi, KCL. I see you in the comments on a couple of other cases and on a couple of the other shows that I appear on. I see you on STS and also on Harvard Lawyer Lee. So thanks for supporting us all. Your viewership means the world to all of us, I know. Question, Lori, how do prosecutors do it when trying cases? Do they have a checklist of questions for each witness that they check off every time the witness responds appropriately that proves guilt? Well, in some regard, they do. So every statute has a list of elements that the prosecutor has to prove. So the prosecutor's always going to make sure, as they are going through and making their lists of questions up, that they're asking the questions that establish every one of those elements. So sure, they do. It's more like an outline than a checklist, but you will see prosecutors just checking their questions off as they go. It's just a way of organizing their thoughts to make sure that they have covered every one of those elements. If one of the elements is that it happened in Fremont County, then you'll see them ask that question. Is Fremont County in the state of Idaho? I mean, some of the questions get a little bit like, really? But they're establishing those elements. So there is the law kind of provides the roadmap, and then they sort of make an outline that proves those elements. Good questions. You guys are getting so legally sharp. You're all going to have to take the bar here pretty soon. TXL8Y817. Okay. Why is the defense waiving their questioning to witnesses regarding testimony from other states on other crimes simply because of an objection? Can you explain this, please? So the prosecution has been asking questions, and they had a little bit of the eye of a needle to thread to get the questions in about Chad's murder. I thought they did a really masterful job of doing that. It isn't necessarily the case that they waive their questioning because of an objection, but the judge does sometimes sustain objections and say, you're right, that question was objectionable. That objection is sustained, and that means the prosecution can't go on and ask that question. If the judge, on the other hand, says that objection's overruled, then the prosecution can go on and pursue that line of questioning. So sometimes the judge rules in the defense's favor and says, you can't go there, can't ask that question. the biggest issue has been this 404B evidence and the idea that there are prior bad acts in Arizona, specifically Charles's murder and shooting at Brandon Boudreaux, that are evidence of prior bad acts. And so what that means is the prosecution has to show the judge, we want it for something else besides just proving that she's a bad person. We want it to prove that there was this common scheme or plan. We want it to prove the motive. We want it to, and so there's a list of things that they can use that evidence for to prove that, but it can't be used to prove she's just a bad person. So the judge has given that cautionary instruction to the jury a couple of times, and it will be given to them again anytime that 404B evidence comes up. But the evidence came in that, the whole story of Charles Vallow's death and Alex's role in it came in, and even the fact that Joe Ryan is dead came in. And that means those are things the jury can consider in making their decisions. So, and I think it does go to that common scheme or plan, and that's why it's coming in. So I didn't really see either side really waiving their right to question about testimony from other states on the other crimes. But there were times that the judge said, nah, that's gone too far. So, but I'm telling you what, sometimes it's like a ping pong match. It's hard to follow those objections and who's objecting and what the judge rules. And it's really hard when you're listening to audio. So good questions, you all. Hi, Maria. Do you think the defense hasn't really pushed back because they don't have much to work with, or are they setting up an ineffective counsel appeal? They are not setting up an ineffective assistance of counsel appeal. As we've discussed until you all are sick of hearing it, ineffective assistance of counsel is a difficult thing to prove. Because not only do you have to prove that the offending lawyer didn't meet typical standards of representation, but you also have to prove that if your lawyer had been effective, the outcome would have been different. And there have been many, many cases where the Supreme Court has said, yeah, you didn't have a great lawyer, but no harm, no foul, because the outcome would have been the same anyway. The evidence was overwhelming that you were guilty. So I don't think they're setting up ineffective assistance of counsel. It really is about them not having a lot to work with. Part of that problem is Lori's really tied their hands. She won't let them bring up the mental health defense, which is their strongest argument. And they're really just stuck having to poke holes in the prosecution's story. Now, I have described reasonable doubt this way, and I'm a visual person. I like things that you can visualize. So I describe it this way. Think of a jigsaw puzzle, a 500-piece jigsaw puzzle. And you take the jigsaw puzzle and you start by figuring out all the borders. You find all the straight pieces and you figure out where the borders are. So now you have the outline and the boundary of this picture. And over time, you find the pieces that match and you put the puzzle together. Now, let's say you get the puzzle all put together and there are still a few pieces missing. Reasonable doubt is if you can look at that picture and you can say, I still know what that picture is. It's still a picture of a garden. And that's a rose, and this is a daffodil, and and these are flowers, and that's then that's a reasonable amount of doubt. You've got some empty spots, but you can still tell what this image is. If, on the other hand, there are enough pieces missing that you look at that and say, I don't know if that's a rose or a dog. because I don't have enough pieces. That's reasonable doubt. That's doubt where you can say, I can't make out for sure what that could be if I just had a couple more pieces. That's the way I think of reasonable doubt. So the problem is if you don't have, now the other alternative is to take all those pieces and rearrange them to make a completely different picture. And that is sometimes possible for the defense. They can take those same facts, rearrange them, and turn that picture into something different. But if you don't have facts that you can rearrange, then you're stuck with plucking pieces of the puzzle out and hoping that you pull out enough of them that somebody on the jury is going to say, I don't know if that's a rose or a dog. Hopefully that makes sense. So I think that's what the defense is left with, because Lori has tied their hands when it comes to a mental health defense. Lori's tied their hands when it comes to, really just getting the speedy trial thing, just invoking her speedy trial. So there's a lot that they have not been able to do because of the constraints she's put on them. So I think they are just trying to poke holes, and because they don't have a lot to work with. Good questions. Hi, Kim. Question: do you think the defense has given up because they expect this verdict to be overturned on appeal due to prosecutorial or judicial errors? No, because I don't think they can count on that. You can never count on your case, the appellate court rescuing you if your case goes bad. So no, I don't think that is their strategy at all. I think they simply don't have a lot to work with, and they're kind of trying to do the best they can with what they have. And it's super frustrating as a defense attorney to have to do that. It's really frustrating. And especially if there's something out there that you could use, except your client doesn't want you to. So, I understand that they feel a little fatalistic about it, because I'm sure they feel like if they could just navigate and negotiate their case in a way that they want to, they would have a better chance, and they would feel more like they had done their job. But in the end, the client is the person who runs the case and decides the way the case will go. And it's ultimately only Lori's decision whether or not to let those things in. So I don't think they've given up, and I don't think they're counting on an appeal based on prosecutors and the judge. I think they may get it because there have been some big mistakes, but I don't think they're counting on it. You want to know about my tattoo? I am happy that they're not too personal, and I am happy to tell you about them. I have one here. It's on my wrist. It's the first one I got. It says "Alles volat proprius," which is the Oregon State, informal Oregon State motto, and it means she flies with her own wings. And that was my very first tattoo. My daughter and I got our first tattoos together. It was to celebrate the fact that I had just turned 60, and I had gotten my master's degree in fine arts and creative writing. And so it was to celebrate those two things. My daughter just turned 21, so we got ink together for the first time. And so that was the first one. The other one, I always do this the wrong direction. The other one is it's very hard to turn the right direction, is three birds. There it is, sitting on a branch, and another bird flying away. And that's a memorial tattoo for my dad. My 86-year-old mother and my sister and I got these in Amsterdam on a trip we took to honor my dad after his passing. So that's the three of us sitting on a branch and daddy flying away. The last one is butterfly. See if I can turn it the right way. because I promised myself that I would get a butterfly every time I published a book. So that is a spray of mountain lupin, which are flowers that bloom in the high desert in Oregon every spring, and a butterfly to celebrate my first book, which is my divorce book. So when this one finally hits the shelf, I'm due for a new butterfly. I have one more. It's on the back of my arm. It's not very easy to see, and it's a matching tattoo with my daughter of a moon and a star, because I used to say, I love you more than the moon and the stars. So next question. Listen, the one thing you all have probably learned about me is that I'm not particularly squeamish when it comes to talking about those kind of personal things. I don't laugh. It cracks me up when people make fun of my eyelashes. It cracks me up when people want to know about my tattoos. I'm kind of an open book that way. Lisa Miller, could you hear the little whispering that Lindsay was doing to Zulema? She was whispering, "Good job, thank you," etc. We could hear. I'm betting the audience couldn't. Maybe not. I don't think it's all that unusual for an attorney who is called a witness, when the witnesses walking by are leaving, to say thank you, even to say good job. Appearing in court when you are not accustomed to it is an incredibly nerve-wracking experience. It's terrifying. And you could tell that both Melanie Gibb and Zulema were very nervous and very worried. Zulema in particular seemed very worried and very measured about the way she spoke, probably because there was an immunity agreement out there somewhere. So I don't know that it's all that unusual. There was no evidence that she was coaching Zulema in any way. And the courtroom, you saw my little diagram, there's quite a bit of distance between the prosecutor and the witnesses, the witness box. And unlike a lot of courtrooms, the lawyers don't ever approach the witness in Idaho courtrooms. So when I was practicing, if I had an exhibit that I want to show the witness, I would say to the judge, do I have permission to approach the witness? And I would get up and hand something to the witness, or say, can you read this? Or, I would get in the witness's bubble. That doesn't happen in Idaho. In Idaho, the documents are all passed through the bailiff to the judge, to the witness. So she wasn't close to Zulema at any point, but there were points that when Zulema left the courtroom, she walked by the prosecution's table. And I don't think it's all that unusual. And even if the gallery did hear that, I mean, it was, thank you or good job. I mean, good job. I don't know. That kind of rolls off people's tongues as a way to tell people you did okay. Does that mean that Zulema did everything that Lindsay Blake was trying to get her to do? I don't think so. Or that she was coached. Yeah, I don't think so. I think it was just, kind of a polite and reassuring thing to do for somebody who was really, really nervous. I mean, I was known to say to a witness as they left, thanks for coming, drive safely, those sort of things. And, I always tried to do it in a tone that was everybody could hear, because it wasn't being secretive, but, it is polite to at least recognize that this isn't a natural place for a witness to come, and it's nerve-wracking, and, sort of reassure them that it meant something for them to be there. Oh, yeah, I know. 1,100 people. We have never had this many people in our chat. Thank you so much for joining us. Believe me, I know that you could be doing a lot of things with your Saturday night. So the fact that you're spending your Saturday night with me and my tattoos and my glass of wine and my quilt squares means the world to me. So thanks. Stephanie DK. Question: do you think it's possible the defense believes they have already achieved their goal, which was to save Lori from the penalty of death? Absolutely. I think this is absolutely true. I don't think there's any argument that they feel like they've already won. They have spared their client from the possibility of the death penalty. So whatever happens from here, it's all downhill for them. I mean, I don't mean to be facetious about that, because certainly she's probably still going to get convicted and get life without parole. However, the death penalty is not hanging over her head, and that's huge. So yeah, I think in a lot of ways, they feel like they achieved what they wanted to achieve from the beginning. Jim Archibald commented in his opening statement that this was a case they were unable to settle, which meant that they needed to bring it to the jury. And I know that I feel that he was disappointed that this was a case that they couldn't resolve without trial. Because he made a point of saying most cases resolve without trial, and we had to bring this one to the jury because we couldn't do it. So yeah, I think that if I were in their shoes, I would feel like I'd already won. That was a huge decision for them, and it was a huge mistake on the part of the prosecutors. Hey, Bo Peep, you're another one I see in everybody's chats, so thanks for joining us here tonight. Do you think David Warwick will be called to discuss the night that he and Mel G were at Lori's when JJ was last seen, and if the defense will hammer him like Pryor did about who slept where? No, Melanie Gibb sort of alluded to the fact that she slept in the same room with David that night, and I don't think anybody really cares where Melanie Gibb slept. And I don't know that David Warwick would add a lot to the conversation. I'm not sure that he has a lot to add to the story. They already really got out of Melanie Gibb what they were trying to get out of David Warwick at the preliminary hearing. So I'd kind of be surprised if he shows up. Melanie Gibb did say that they're still married, so I don't know what that means, but it seems to me like they probably won't call him. He's probably not needed. Dee Dee, question: do you think it turned out better for Chad and Lori's case to be severed? Does it give a better chance to prove guilt? There's no question that it's better for Chad. John Pryor has been in that courtroom every day, and he will be there every day, and he will know every in and out of the prosecution's theory and their story and their evidence, and that is a huge, huge bonus for him. It also increases the possibility that the state may, depending on how their case goes, they may agree to negotiate and take the death penalty off the table for Chad, and he may get a plea. So it absolutely turned out to be better for Chad. For Lori, I don't think it mattered one way or the other. The evidence was going to come in against Lori, whether it came in against her and Chad both or not. So I don't think it was any benefit to Lori, but it certainly was a much bigger benefit to Chad. As far as increasing the chance to prove guilt, I suppose in one way it would be, because Lori won't have Chad there with the two of them pointing fingers at one another and saying, that was your fault. No, that was your fault. So there are things that she can sort of hang on Chad, and Chad won't be around to refute. So in that way, I think perhaps the prosecution has a cleaner case and a cleaner path to a finding of guilt. You guys are getting so legally sophisticated that these questions are getting harder and harder. I'm not answering the same silly little questions about how you serve people or any of those things. You guys are coming up with the hard balls. Christy Rogers, is the prosecution required to admit to the jury if Zulema or Mel G has immunity? The issue of Zulema's immunity, let me think. We know Zulema has immunity. It did not come up with Melanie Gibb. They are required to tell the defense if a witness has immunity. I was just trying to remember whether it came up in Zulema's at all, and I don't think it did. It's possible that they didn't get into the area of questioning that would activate that immunity. And see, we don't really know what Zulema had immunity for. I have some speculations about that, but it appears that maybe they didn't get into that realm. Now, does that mean that she didn't give them information that helped them uncover evidence that did go toward her guilt? Sure. I mean, typically what happens is you say to that person, give me information that is going to help me build my case against somebody else, and agree to come and testify truthfully if you're called. And if they do those things, then they have met their obligations. And it may be that the subject that they were asked about isn't something they'll be asked about at trial, but it's information that they gave that helped uncover information that helped the prosecution. So it didn't come up, but the prosecution is required to tell the defense. And if they get into that area of immunity, the defense can tell the jury. Are the family witnesses, possibly sister, possibly Garth, allowed to watch trial before they testify? No, that was one of the issues that came up pre-trial, was who is a victim, and that includes immediate families. So the judge decided Summer Shiflett, Colby, and Kay would be considered immediate family. Everybody else out if they're testifying. So nobody else can be in the courtroom until after they testify, if they plan to. If the prosecution plans to call them as witnesses, they have to wait outside until. So Summer Shiflett, she's the sister, has been is considered immediate family, and if she were wanting to, she could sit in, but she hasn't been there. Garth, no, because he's not immediate family to Lori. He would be to Chad. So he could be allowed in before he testifies for in Chad's trial, but not in Lori's. So the only people have been those three. Do you think the defense will call witnesses, and if so, whom? I don't know. The defense was very clear in talking to the jury that they have not, and what Jim Archibald said was, we haven't decided if we're going to call witnesses because we don't have to. We don't have to prove her innocence. We don't have to call any witnesses. The defense always says that in opening statements. So I don't think anybody should read too much into that. A lot of people have said, oh, they're not going to call any witnesses. Well, we don't know. And I don't think they know, because they're seeing how the prosecution's case unfolds. They may have an idea of some potential witnesses that they would like to call, but they're going to have to see how it all unfolds before they decide whether or not they're going to call witnesses. And if they do, it will be witnesses that will be called to directly rebut some piece of testimony. Spring memory. Oh, I wish I had a spring memory right now. All I have is cold, wet spring right now and allergies. Go figure. If I have to have allergies, at least I ought to have some sunny weather to go with them, right? Spring memory. How does an immunity agreement work? Doesn't a witness have to answer questions regardless? Sure, but the questions could be questions from law enforcement. They don't necessarily have to be questions at trial because trial is all about strategy and about telling a story. And it may be that that witness gives law enforcement information that leads them to stuff that strengthens the prosecution's case and but that information may directly not be something the prosecution feels the need to present at trial. So the prosecution says, show up and testify honestly if asked, and give us all the information you have about XYZ. So yes, the immunity agreement says they have to answer questions, but it could be law enforcement's questions. And just because they answer law enforcement's question and give law enforcement a bunch of information doesn't necessarily mean that it's information that the prosecution is going to put on at trial. So still could be helpful. Ladybug lady. Why do you think Zulema has immunity? I guess I was expecting a bombshell of evidence, but I did not. I don't think we got into the reason why Zulema has immunity. And I have my own speculation about it, but I'm not sure it's really fair to go into that. I think that she came and testified honestly. She said she thought she repeated what Alex had said about feeling he was the fall guy. But I wonder if she assisted Alex in his death. Let's put it that way. And that certainly would be a crime and would be something that they could offer her immunity for. Lori Colley, did Melanie Gibb lie on the stand about the life insurance? No, I don't think so. I think she just got it wrong. I mean, people make mistakes and memory is funny. It's been more than 3 years. It's been 4 years, almost. So it doesn't surprise me that people remember things differently than they might have 2 or 3 years ago. And I think she just got it wrong. I think she was just confused about when she had the conversation with Lori about whether or not Charles had changed his life insurance, because the evidence is very clear. And why would she lie about that? I mean, it doesn't make any sense for it to be a lie. I guess that's what I'd say. The evidence is very clear from everywhere else, including text messages from Lori and the insurance documents, all of that. That evidence is really clear that Lori didn't know before Charles died that he changed his life insurance. And you know, what benefit would it have for Melanie to say, "Oh no, Lori knew about that"? I mean, I think it's just as simple as she remembers wrong, and that kind of stuff happens. Memories fade, and details get foggy when cases get years old. So yeah, I don't think that she lied. Wouldn't make any sense. She wouldn't really have any motivation to lie. So I don't think she lied. I think she just remembered it differently, and I don't think in the grand scheme of things it makes a lot of difference, because there's ample proof that Lori didn't know until after Charles died. So we're coming up on 2.5 hours. I don't know about you all, but I'm pretty tired. And so I'm going to invite you, if we haven't answered your questions, to please include them in the comments down below. And I will do my very best to get to them. Do follow along on Twitter. Now, I will say I am furiously taking notes, as you all saw. And so I am not doing a constant stream of live tweets. Gigi from Pretty Lies and Alibis is. She's sitting right next to me. So if you want a blow-by-blow description of every question, follow Gigi. I am doing live tweets as I can in between my note-taking and doing some short videos as I can. The judge has really kept the schedule really compressed, and so it's been hard sometimes to get those shorts out in those short amount of time and still wolf down an apple at lunchtime. So, but stick with us. I am going to try and get a newsletter out. I started working on it, and I'm here to tell you it is 9 pages long, and I'm not done. So I fear to put something out that long for fear people will just ignore it, but at least I'm going to try. So please, thank you so much for joining us. Thanks for 1,100 people being in chat tonight. If you are new to the channel, thanks for joining us. For those of you who don't know me, I didn't introduce myself. I'm a retired criminal lawyer, did both prosecution and defense. I'm writing a book about the Lori Vallow case, and we are in it up to our eyeballs. So I just want to thank all of you for being here tonight, spending your Saturday night with us, or if you're on the replay crew, having coffee with us in the morning. Thanks to all of you who are following from around the world. Thanks for your generous contributions to our moderators. And please join me Monday on Surviving the Survivor with Joel, and on Tuesday with Harvard lawyer Lee for some guest appearances. And keep up with us on Twitter, and I will be back to you on Tuesday to talk all about the most recent developments. So thanks so much for joining us tonight. Thanks for going along with us, and stick here for the latest. See ya.